Okay, I'm going to get started. More people will likely be joining, but just in the interest of time, welcome everybody. I'm Isadora Schaller. I was previously the co-president of Global Women Leadership in Bologna, and I'm currently the deputy director of events for Global Women in Leadership in DC. Thank you so much for everybody who's joined. We're really excited about this panel today. Also, thank you to Bahar for planning this amazing diversity week in this new environment. The SAIS technology team for helping organize the virtual panel, and the panelists as well. I'm going to provide a brief introduction for each of the panelists who are joining us today. Anika Penn is an investor, entrepreneur, and global health pioneer. She currently connects innovation with capital at Bailey Guilford. Previously, she served as entrepreneur in residence at the Jill Kerr Conway Innovation Entrepreneur Center at Smith College, and was a co-founder and CEO of Frontier Health, a marketplace for innovative, frugal medical devices for the developing world. Her career has traversed medical research, international HIV/AIDS and reproductive health, health innovation, and human rights policy. A 2010 SAIS graduate, as a student she focused on China studies and wrote a thesis on the implementation of China's HIV/AIDS policies. She is the current vice president and incoming president of the Johns Hopkins Alumni Association and sits on the Johns Hopkins Board of Trustees. Rebecca Aman, who will be our moderator for this event, is an associate director at SAIS Global Careers and manages the corporate social responsibility and private sector technology portfolios. She has worked in higher education administration for nearly a decade and focuses on the areas of academic and professional advising, program management, and experiential learning. She was most recently the associate director of the SAIS Master of Arts in Global Policy, where she managed the program's domestic residencies and international residencies, co-instructed its capstone course, and organized its professional development and co-curricular programming. Rebecca is also an advisor for the nonprofit Global Unites, which supports the work of young peace builders around the world. As a SAIS student, Rebecca concentrated in African studies and international law and was a graduate assistant for Global Careers in 2011. Our third speaker, Ileana Valle, serves as Vice President and COO of Equianimity Foundation, a US-based nonprofit organization committed to inclusive, sustainable, and transformative international development. She delivers in-country project oversight and strategic direction to EQF's international presence across the Latin American region. Ms. Valle brings considerable on-the-ground experience leading locally driven and contextualized interventions throughout the region. Most notably, she lent her expertise to the Department of Justice Bureau of Prisons, delivering financial risk advisory. Ms. Valle has lived and worked in Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia, and Italy. She currently serves on the executive board for the Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation. She previously served on the executive board of the Association of Latino Professionals for America and is chair of the board of directors for Latinos Leading Tomorrow. All right, over to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you so much, Isadora. And thank you, Anika and Ileana, for joining us today. I know that this is an important subject, kind of irrespective of the climate, but even more so now when people are looking for genuine connections and ways to connect with each other. So before I start, I want to take just a moment just to put my SAIS careers hat on and let some of the students who are joining us today know about some of the activities and programming that we have that's specifically centered on networking. So they have an opportunity to kind of avail some of those programs and events that we have coming up. The first, of course, is our one-hop mentoring platform, which I'm sure many of our students have seen and many of our alumni, thankfully, have joined. We have over 2,000 alumni on that platform, and it's a great way for students to connect with alumni, both from SAIS, but also from the greater Hopkins network. And they can engage in things like short-term and long-term mentoring. My colleague Luke Connolly in our Global Careers Office is the person who manages the long-term mentoring program, and we encourage students to apply for that in late October. So that's a great opportunity to have something a little bit beyond just a coffee with somebody, but something a little bit more built out. The next is something that I'm doing alongside one of my other colleagues, Setu Van Laer Hodges, and that is our SAIS Life Design Group, which we'll be picking up in a couple of weeks. This Life Design Group is a group of students that will be meeting about every other week. I should say every 3 or 4 weeks to connect and look at ideas related to career exploration and networking. So it's a nice opportunity to kind of build in and hone some of your career engagement skills early on. And finally, I just want to remind everyone that we, of course, are all available We have several coaches here in DC and colleagues in Bologna and HNC who are able to connect you with SAIS alumni and other contacts in different places that you're hoping to target. So just starting off with some of those key points, I wanted to now open it up to the people you were here to actually hear from, Anika and Ileana. So again, as I was mentioning, networking is such an important part of every person's life. And I'm sure there are important aspects to both Ileana and Anika. So it'd be great if each of you could just start by saying what networking has meant to you, if it's a tool that you've used pre-COVID and how so, and just kind of give us a little bit of insight into how you view this platform. Ileana, would you like to start? I think you're actually on mute.
Yes, I was.
Here you are.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be on this panel. I think it's a very important subject, and I actually also have to excuse myself. There's usually vendors out my window, so if you hear some noise in the background, I do apologize. But it is an important subject to touch. And what has networking meant to me? Well, you know, I think in the beginning, everyone feels very nervous. It feels inadequate, doesn't understand how to navigate the landscape. Sometimes I even questioned why I needed to do this. And as I grew in my career path, I realized that it was not just so much about the networking. I think that's such a scary word. It's people, I think, almost sometimes like get tired of hearing it over and over again, but it's the ability to make genuine connections. And that's what it's meant to me, right? Like I've met really important folks that are still in my life. And, you know, I met them through a professional network. They're now friends, some that I would even dare say family. So I think it's in that regard, just creating those special connections. And then on the other hand, it's making myself visible, right? So, you know, when it comes to networking, it's about other people understanding what work you're doing, what amazing work you want to do. And so creating that visibility for yourself, because, you know, you can be working hard and nobody really knows, you know, what you're doing. So it's important to kind of put it out there for people to know. So yeah, so that's essentially, Anika?
Sure. I'll say this. I think Ileana is right that I think the term networking has a lot of sort of ugly connotations and people are sort of afraid of it. And I'll say, I feel really lucky in that my parents, I grew up in the Midwest and my parents are both salespeople. So my entire upbringing was about watching my parents sort of make friends and network and go to cocktail parties. And in the 80s in the Midwest, there weren't as many things for adults to do that were free of children. So if, you know, they got invited to a cocktail party, that meant 4-year-old me and 10-year-old my brother were going to the cocktail party and, you know, drinking fruit punch and watching the adults talk. And you know, I got to see from early on that, you know, my parents would sort of build connections with people, some of those people ended up becoming friends of theirs. Some of those people ended up buying cars from my dad or real estate from my mom, and not immediately, over a period of years. And it's about building a connection with someone and building trust. And then, you know, if and when the time comes where you have an opportunity to solve a problem for them, or if they have an opportunity to help you, that's what it would reflect in their work. And, you know, they would have good years and bad years, but it wasn't necessarily this thing that was so purely sort of nakedly ambitious, but really about how can we all help each other. And sometimes helping someone, it means saying, you know, you should go, I know someone else who can help you. Sometimes making a connection and building through trust is about saying, I can't help you, or I need help. And throughout a relationship with someone, you know, it goes through ebbs and flows. And so there are times when you have the ability to help someone else and they have the ability to help you. But it's funny, I think, you know, I have this mom, this 76-year-old mom from Ohio, and she's in some ways kind of naive, but in others, she's like, people always want to help you. You just have to make it easy for them. I'm not sure that's true, in the way that she believes that it's true.
Maybe in the Midwest, yeah.
but
Ohio.
But I do think the larger, on a grand scale, that is generally pretty true. And so that's how I approach networking, that I want to help as many people as I can. I'm going to assume until told that other people want to help me. They may be able to, they may not be able to. And it's really just about building trust. So that's...
Yeah, no, I think those are all great points. I mean, there are a few things that I definitely want to pick up on and carry forward in the conversation. I think the idea of building trust, the idea of building lasting relationships kind of from that initial initial conversations that you begin to have. For our students, and since many of them are maybe trying to use SAIS as an opportunity to network into new networks or into new industries that they don't have a lot of exposure to, can you give a little bit of insight and maybe talk about pre-COVID and currently in this environment, how students can go about doing that? How do you tap into these networks? How do you make that first step? Ileana, did you want to start first?
Yeah, so interestingly, I remember, you know, when I first was really intentional about wanting to network, and I think that's a very key word about like the intentionality about like, you know, what do you want to get out of it? It's not being calculating, it's not being disingenuous, it's just kind of what you want to go out there and find out. What do you want to learn? Who do you want to meet? And so when I first wanted to really be intentional, I had a conversation with someone that told me just start with joining a board for a cause organization that's working on a cause that you really care a lot about. I mean, you really want to meet like-minded people that are doing really cool work as you. And, you know, I was still in school at the time. Of course, I you know, joining a board, what did that mean, right? So, you know, there was a lot more to just there's the volunteering aspect. You can volunteer and get to know other people and and because people will learn from each other in these interactions. And so that's sort of how I started it. And I think from a pre-COVID perspective, I don't necessarily think it was easier necessarily. I think there's still sort of that element of wanting to be intentional. You know, what do you want to get out of it? And then it took me a little while to understand, you know, that it wasn't just kind of this disingenuous activity that I was doing after work or while I was still a student. It was actually being authentic. And one of the things that really stuck to me was, you know, how can you give of others before you even ask them to help you, right? So how do you help first? And so little by little, I started to look at it from that perspective. And, you know, I would go to events that I was really interested in and really was interested, and I did my homework, right? With the intentionality piece, I would do my homework and understand who was going to be at some conference that I wanted to go to or some gathering, or even if I wanted to approach someone regarding volunteering, who was doing who's on the board or who's doing that work, and you know, picking up just sort of like a string, and you know, if you have an opportunity to talk to that person, just, you know, I'm really interested in XYZ work, you know, how can you talk to me a little bit more? It's essentially, it's similar to the informational interviews that we're taught to do in school. You know, you want to learn about different aspects, right? Like we're a lifelong learner, and we're always going to learn, and we can approach it that way. And then, you know, and now with post-COVID, I think one of the things that I really want to point out is not to have students feel discouraged. I know this is a very discouraging time, from having, you know, virtual classes to virtual graduations and now virtual interactions with people. It can be a little bit discouraging, but I think in a sense, the generation that's going to really learn how to hone on this virtual environment is actually going to be a step ahead from the folks that kind of knew how to do it with, you know, going to an event. And so I think some of those points still hold true about being intentional, doing your homework. And what I've noticed recently too, there's a lot of organizations that are opening up more to virtual events, virtual gatherings, and people are more receptive to virtual coffees versus, you know, before the situation. So before I could have been like, hey, let's have a virtual coffee. That was kind of weird. And so I think now in a sense, people are a lot more receptive. One of the things that I would say for myself, I'm actually currently based out of Colombia. And so I remember in the beginning, I've been here since last year, and in my multiple stints in other countries, I get to miss out on all the really cool stuff that's happening in Washington or in other cities. But now those opportunities are made available. So, you know, one thing that can be done is, hey, shooting someone a note. I really enjoyed what you said in XYZ virtual space. I really like to learn a little bit more about what you're doing, and just keeping in mind that, you know, you still want to be authentic, you still want to be sincere about wanting to learn. And as Anika said earlier, it takes time. Relationships, it's building that relationship, and then eventually you'll have the comfort to say, hey, like, I saw this opportunity. And I know for students it could be sort of that shorter time period, but a lot of professionals understand that students are looking also for opportunities, and you know, that's very realistic as well.
Great. No, thank you. I think that's a lot of great insight. Anika, do you have anything to add about how you're navigating this virtual space and how to network in there?
Yeah, I think one of the positives, I'll just piggyback on what Ileana said. One of the positives is that you're no longer confined to your region or your city. And so, you know, that's a great thing to take advantage of. Another thing that came to mind as she was speaking was, so I graduated in 2010. I wasn't quite sure. I knew I wanted to live in New York because I already lived there, and I had already lived in Washington, and I didn't want to be there. So, and I had a rent stabilized apartment. So I just moved to New York back to New York without really, I mean, I had sort of a temporary job that I ended up staying at. The recession was still happening in New York. So I just started volunteering at SAIS New York Alumni Club meetings. And I would work the door, make it sound, these SAIS events sound like there's some fancy nightclub, but, you know, I would work the door, and then you know, people saw me volunteer. I would try to ask a question at every event. And when you ask a question at an event, then you get to say your name, and, you know, people remember you. And then I would take notes at the events of people that I thought either had really interesting jobs or, you know, said something really interesting that I could talk to them about during the cocktail hour. And, you know, then I worked myself onto the board of the SAIS New York Alumni Club, and I got to manage events. And I'll say I had a job that I really, really, really didn't like at the time. I mean, really, I was pretty miserable. And I had maybe 300 coffees, informational interviews over a period of a couple of years. And one of the things I was able to do that you can't do anymore, but was I would manage the RSVP list for a lot of the SAIS New York Alumni Club events, which means that I had the email address of every single person that that RSVP'd for an event. So if 80 people RSVP'd, and then the alumni office, which was great, and they should have took that over, which is wonderful. But I still had about 300 emails of folks, and I put those into a spreadsheet, and I used those. You know, I met you at this event. I see that, you know, you work at this place. Can I have half an hour of your time to talk about, you know, these two things? And then at the end of each of those meetings, I would, with only 5 minutes left, I would say, if it hadn't come up, is there anyone else that you can think of that I should talk to? And then you're moving outside of that, of the, your shared network to that person's network. And a lot of times it would be a call if the person wasn't in New York. And so I would always say, my advice to someone would be to, remember to ask at the end, if it doesn't come up, can you think of anyone else I should talk to? And then ask if they would be willing to introduce you. Because often if someone else is willing to introduce you, that you're more likely to get an email back saying, sure, I'll meet with, this kid that you've recommended me, to meet. But it was through volunteering, Ileana's right on that. I volunteered that I ended up getting asked to be a SAIS representative to the Johns Hopkins Alumni Association. And I was very active in that, volunteering. And it was through that being active in that and asking questions and being helpful, that they then asked me to be the head of one of the committees. And then after that, they asked me to be the second vice president. And then they asked me to be the first vice president. And next month I'll be the president. The president and the vice president serve on the Johns Hopkins Board of Trustees. So, and it was through a SAIS alum on the Board of Trustees who is a partner at Bailey Gifford that I have my job now. So I started desperate to find a job in 2010, volunteering for SAIS New York Alumni Club events. And I now have one of the best jobs I've ever had in my life, all through SAIS alums. And along the way, I started a business, having not found a job in the three fields that I wanted. And I see that there's a question from an anonymous attendee about networking effectively if you don't actually know what you want to do. I had three things that I kind of wanted to do, and I didn't end up doing any of those things. So it's really about sort of mapping out things that are interesting to you and asking people what their path, who are doing something related to those things, what their path is. And then I will stop talking in just a second, but I started a company along the way. And the first investor for my company came from the wife of a SAIS alum that I met at an event. And that Jance and Nicole are dear, dear friends of mine now. And they're just someone I made a sort of sarcastic quip to at a cocktail party. We ended up going to dinner. We've been friends for years. And Johannes went to SAIS, his wife went to SIPA, and she runs a startup. And we have the same early stage investor for our startup. So every opportunity that I have had has come from someone I met, not that I went to school with, but that I met through the SAIS network after school. So I stand before you like nothing that I have right
for
now.
how this should be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks, Anika. That's great.
And in fact, I'm gonna interrupt for a quick second. In fact, the organization where I am now, I co-founded it, and the my business partner, was someone that I met through an event that I volunteered at. So that's where we met. So there you go.
Seeing it paid forward. Yeah, actually, Ileana, that was a question I was going to ask you, if you've seen any of these networking interactions. And you can use this example and highlight that a bit more. But anytime you've seen a networking kind of initial conversation develop into something more, whether it's a mentorship, which is something that we want to talk to students about, and exploring that opportunity, and how you go about doing that, kind of transitioning that. But so much of it is about that kind of stewardship with those relationships, right? Like making sure you're either diligent about, noting those emails and making those connections. Sometimes noting the last time you met with somebody. I know I've seen that happen with quite a few people. But Ileana, if you could highlight some of those times for you.
Yes, of course. So I'm going to use this as the example I just spoke about, and then just kind of draw a little bit more from there. So about 8 years ago, I met Karen, who is my business partner now, and we met because we volunteered at an event, and I wanted to network. It was around Hispanic Heritage Month, which is where we are now. And I wanted to be at the event and get to know folks without having to pay. So I volunteered. And so that's another good way of doing it as well. And she also volunteered, and that's how we got to know each other. And shortly after, I'd say a few months after that encounter, I moved to Central America to work at a small nonprofit doing advocacy work. And she was at my going away. Of course, I had, we kind of hit it off, had a lot of things in common and stayed in touch. And I think one area that's really important is to follow up, periodically check in with folks. I know, I've been guilty of not doing it as much, but I think one takeaway from the pandemic is making sure, you're checking in with us, particularly now when we can't take things for granted. So, and that keeps sort of that relationship and that authenticity and that relationship really nourished. And so I left, and here we are, 7 to 8 years after kind of getting to know each other, and nourishing that relationship throughout this time, when one day we were like, hey, we really need to start doing our own thing. We had the same vision in a lot of ways. And so I think that, it eventually, and it doesn't have to take that long. I think in this case, it did take quite a bit, but you can meet someone and really admire their career trajectory and I think the most, just to harp sort of on the same kind of point, just kind of checking in with them. Like, I would love to stay in contact. I really like the work that you're doing, actually checking in. And then eventually you may be on that person's radar when an opportunity may come up. And after all the conversations that you've had with that person, they're like, oh, this person is perfect. But if the relationship sort of just died somewhere, that person doesn't have you in their radar. So I think that that's an important aspect of it, and how I have identified several mentors through those interactions, as well as through volunteering that I've done. I've also participated. I've really invested a lot in in my professional development. So I've applied for leadership programs that, there's some stuff out there if you want to start sort of developing leadership programs, that some of them may cost money, but some of them have scholarships depending on the situation. And then from there, you can identify someone at your workplace if you do land your first job and, you're not really liking it, kind of like what Anika said, and you start identifying a person within the organization that you may want to learn a little bit more about the career trajectory, and that relationship can actually continue on even after you leave the actual organization. So that's essentially how I've addressed it.
Great, thanks. And Anika, do you have any insight into how to actually do that? How do you check in with somebody without making it awkward? How do you have those emails to kind of maintain that relationship? What kind of things?
It can be really hard, especially when you're on just want to acknowledge that, you're on the sort of needing end at this point, right? And someone may not email you back and you think, oh, I'm pestering them, or I don't want to bother them, or they didn't email me back, so they clearly don't want to meet. I think particularly now, everybody's really kind of struggling. I mean, there are people that are really struggling, but even folks who are doing really well in life, who are successful, they're at home with their kids and they're tired, and it's hard. So I think two things. One, I think, we have to give everyone, no matter where in life they are, a little bit of grace with responding to emails. And then I think, but that also means that they're going to give you a little bit more grace, because we're in a weird time. I mean, a multi-dimensional insanity is going on. So I think what I did before is, I had pages and pages of notes. I actually just moved and I found some of my old find a job and informational interview notebooks. And I made little assignments for myself. We talked about this thing, we talked about medical devices. And then if I saw an article, maybe, a month later that was of interest or that reminded me of something that person said, I would send it to them. And it would just kind of spark I found this article, it reminded me of what you said about FDA approval for medical devices. What do you think of this? Or did you already know this? And then you kind of just keep this little conversation going without seeming like you're being, naggy or too annoying. I think also, maybe I'm just old fashioned, but I was always taught to be really, really, my mother was a thank you notes Nazi. Like, we weren't allowed to play with our toys at Christmas, or if you got checks for your birthday, you couldn't put them in the bank until you wrote the thank you notes. So and I have profound thank you note shame. So I always try to follow up very quickly with thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated what you said about this, this, and this. And then it's a good way to check in with them. And thanks for doing agreeing to introduce me to this person. I can't wait to talk to them. Look forward to speaking with you again. Just 5 minutes, because it shows someone that you appreciated, that their time. And then you follow up a few weeks later, a month later, even 6 months. It's not a big deal. And then if they don't respond, it's okay. You don't really know what's going on in someone's life. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to talk to you or don't want to hear from you or didn't appreciate your email. I'm not sure I really answered your question.
No, I think that was great. I think, finding those reasons to check in, I think the sending of an article, that's great. Sending a thank you note and using that as another opportunity to kind of reinvigorate the conversation. Any kind of check-ins. I know for our students, even writing a paper and using that as an opportunity to connect with somebody and also to reconnect with them after the paper has been turned in, published, whatever happens with it. So just using those opportunities, and I think that's a great way. I'm going to weave in a question from our Q&A box. Leora is asking, do you have any advice for how to recognize when someone can turn into an important contact later in life or in a career? How do you recognize those kind of exceptionally great people?
I don't necessarily, you don't know. So just be nice to everyone. I don't have any oh, this person seems like they're going to be a really important contact for me. When I was, when I was at, physical events, I did not know when I chatted up Nicole that she would end up introducing me to my first angel investor 4 years later. There's just literally, you just hit it off with people, and there's no real point in being strategic, or I don't mean strategic. There's no point in trying to separate the sort of wheat from the chaff. I mean, if people are dishonest or if someone seems like a bullshitter, maybe don't talk to them. But I think that's true, period. Right? Yeah. But, and maybe my parents are sort of old school salespeople. My dad was never be rude to the front desk person. That's just a recipe for disaster. And always be rude. Always be nice to everyone. And I remember him telling me a story about someone he couldn't get into an office. And obviously we're African American, and so sometimes you just don't have access in the ways that you would want to. So, but my dad knew the janitor in the building, and because his mom and my grandma knew each other, whatever, some connection. Janitor's Black, my dad's Black. And the janitor kind of snuck him in and my dad to the building, and my dad was able to build a relationship that led to selling a fleet of cars, and we ended up going to Disney World that year. all because my dad had this relationship with the janitor at the building. So I kind of, yeah, I think it's difficult to separate those things, but I think, just be nice to everybody.
I think that's a great start. Yeah. Ileana, I wanted to, since this event is being sponsored by BSU and Will, I think that there is added complexity sometimes for women and people of color. And we're so lucky to be able to kind of tease into some of these different perspectives and experiences. Do you think there are any differences between how men and women network? And if you have any insight into, I know this is going to start hopefully getting a little bit more juicy in terms of kind of unpacking some harder elements of all of this as we navigate it together. But you had any insights on special considerations for women as we network?
Yes, I 100% think that men and women network differently. I also think it's from the perspective of their certain, the perception of, men behave a certain way, or statistically also, men tend to carry themselves with much more self-confidence than sometimes women do, even from that perspective. But then there's also the added challenge that as a woman and you want to, really take charge of your networking and you want to reach out to someone, it happens to be a male, and you're genuinely interested in learning about what that person does, and that person completely misreads the intention and decides to start flirting for whatever reason. Or I've had people forwardly send me messages on LinkedIn that are not professional related, and I'm like, this is not a dating site. So I think there is that added challenge, and I think it's understanding. So I do tell a lot of colleagues, friends, and even women that I mentor, students, that this is a reality. It's unfortunate, and it should not happen this way, because men should absolutely behave 100% professionally, and sometimes they do not. And so I think it's understanding that, this is a reality. It's going to happen. I think this kind of aligns a little bit to the question of how you recognize if someone's going to be an important contact later. Like even if that person could probably open all the doors, but that person was unprofessional in the way they addressed you, it's okay to try to find someone else to network with who can conduct a more professional sort of behavior, and that's okay. That one person is not going to trump all things that can happen, all good things, right? And maintain professionalism at all times. Just with any unpleasant situation, just walk away from it, be professional, because I think sometimes, at least in my case, I can sense that. Like, I can sense when the conversation is full of something that I don't want to engage in. And so then I politely just kind of end the conversation, and that's what I do. But that does not mean that, we have to behave differently. It's not, we should never feel like we're in a place of burden to behave differently, so men don't react that way. Women should absolutely be intentional with their networking. It's unfortunate that some people who behave this way and want to make it a lot more challenging for us women out there. And never downplay any self-worth either, because I think in certain situations, men can be very, they can be condescending, and they could, in the way they address as well from a different perspective, like whether it's, I've had situations where men are very arrogant, and it's just an unpleasant situation where I feel like maybe I might have done something wrong. No, just never feel like it's it's our fault, if we conducted ourselves in a professional way. And I know there's going to be, I think for women, it's a lot more, it's statistically, right, it happens a lot more frequently with the imposter syndrome, particularly with, you know, in the, you know, in the underserved communities or people of color, kind of feeling, you know, maybe it was something that I might have done. So I think that these unpleasant situations sometimes can dictate how sometimes we feel about ourselves, but I think it, you know, we should be cognizant of whenever we are feeling that certain way and how to address it sort of openly and head on, to understand what was out of our control and what is in our control.
Mm-hmm. No, I think those are great perspectives. Anika, do you have anything to add on that specific issue?
I think it's touched on so many really great points. I'll say, like, I have imposter syndrome all the time still. So it happens to everybody, and you know, it's a tough one to deal with. But you know, I don't have anything to add. Go ahead.
Great, and I don't know if it's the case for anybody else, but the sound is a little bit low with Anika. Ileana, did it sound like that for you as well?
It faded a little. You sounded a little sort of far away.
Your sound was a little faint.
Yeah,
so
I'm working on it.
Oh yeah, no, that was great. Yeah, it's perfect. I think you're back. Great, Ileana, just a quick question for you while we work on Anika's sound. If you could just tell us a little bit about, I mean, you've mentioned, we had a question come in through the chat, you know, being able to find mentors from our specific, you know, networks that we've created. Do you have any insight on how to make that ask? Is it a formal ask when you want someone to mentor you, or do you think it's a little bit more amorphous than that?
I think it's the latter. I think I had a lot of people advise me that it's okay to ask people openly. I think that it all depends on how the relationship is going, how you're, you know, how receptive you feel that person may be. If you feel, many people are going to feel very very honored and flattered to hear that, you know, we want them to mentor you. And then there's some situations where you may not feel like in the first sort of couple interactions, you feel as comfortable being so straightforward. And so I had both situations happen where I was open with someone about wanting them to mentor me, and they were completely flattered. But I felt that that receptive nature from that person. And there was the other situation where I wasn't as comfortable asking, but I really wanted to learn from them. So we just used to check in periodically. I'm like, is it okay to check in? And we sort of, it turned into an unofficial kind of mentorship relationship. And I think that happens a lot more frequently than we give credit for, I believe. You know, you don't have to make it formal every single time. And I think you can have both. And so it all depends on the relationship and how you're nurturing and forging that relationship, and just feeling sort of that comfort level to outwardly ask, or just simply make it unofficial. And you know, you can be planning on the sidelines, I'm going to ask this, I'm going to ask that, but you know, that person may not know, you know, from a formal perspective that this is happening, and that's okay too. I think in my perspective, it's happened both ways.
Sure. And would you find that most of your mentors are women, or do they vary?
So the majority have been women, but I have had the unofficial mentorship, and I wonder if it's because he was a man, but the unofficial mentor that I had, it was a man. And yeah, I think I've you know, I've also had, you know, spoken with friends who they are intentional about having a man and a woman. because they bring different perspectives to the professional world. And I think that's absolutely valid. I haven't always been as great at doing that, being as intentional, but I know a lot of professionals that do that as well. So I think you can get a lot of perspective, particularly, you know, from a one hand, from a woman who understands the challenges of networking and being in a professional male dominated sectors, or in just navigating a professional career as a woman. And then you know, you can get also the other types of insights from men who won't have those perspectives, and that's okay. They can provide other insights as well.
Great. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point about getting different perspectives and seeking those mentorships out. Anika, do we have you back?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. So the question that I just asked Ileana, I'd love to hear your take on it too. How do you ask someone to be your mentor? And as you develop these mentorships, is it something that's kind of formalized, like routine check-ins? Do you have any thought process into determining your mentors in your life?
Yeah, I never officially asked anyone to be my mentor. I think I just bothered people and asked them for coffee on a regular basis. And that leaves you with a little bit more flexibility, I think. There were times in my career where I am still, where I really could have used an official mentor relationship. And I don't think I really had, I know that I didn't have an official one, but I had several people that I could lean on for different things throughout my career. So when I ran the company, you know, I built this group of women co-founders, and we would meet on Friday, and everyone was at a different stage of their company, company's development. When I joined the board, you know, I just sought the board of trustees for Johns Hopkins. I sought out the other Black women that were on the board, and, you know, and they were, you know, as you would be in that kind of situation. For the most part, you know, when there are only a few of you, folks are generally pretty giving with their time. So I've been able to meet for coffee or meet for dinner, or you know, have a Zoom call with my unofficial board mentors, who are women who are far more successful than me, and, you know, give me some of their time because they, you know, want to see me succeed. But I wouldn't say that if you called up, you know, Bahija Jalal and said, "Are you Anika's mentor?" I'm sure she would say no, but I consider her that. So, yeah, sometimes it doesn't have to be formalized.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think there's such a variety there. Anika, you brought up this really great point that I want to kind of pick on a bit. You mentioned that in certain places there might only be a few of us, whether it's women, whether it's, you know, people of color, whether it's women who are people of color. Can you kind of give us a little bit of insight into how you navigate those, you know, predominantly not like you spaces, whether it's, you know, certain industries that might have, sorry, what was it?
America,
yes. How do you navigate living in America? No, if you had some insight into how do you do that? I mean, I think we often will look for those with the most interest, a common interest or commonalities. But when it really is just a room full of people who just look nothing like you, how do you break through?
I think it depends on the situation. You know, it can get uncomfortable. I think you have to, and I think, you know, maybe it's just, I'll just speak for myself, but, you know, I have a very large African-American family, but I grew up on the other side of town from them, in a town that was predominantly white. So you sort of get used to sizing up people and situations very quickly, and sometimes you're wrong, but you know, first thing, and this goes back to what Ileana was saying about imposter syndrome, the first thing you want to do is realize that you belong there. Whether they want you there or not, you belong there, and you have a right to be in whatever the situation is. And then the second thing you do is you try to find people with whom you agree on something they've said, or you just find areas of commonality. And maybe the area of commonality isn't that you grew up, you know, African American and female in America. Maybe it's that you both like Lake Erie or something. But it's a really tough one. But I'll say this, something that I was told early on is, life is not a meritocracy. Being smart and we're taught that it is in America, but it's not. Being smart and working really hard can get you far, but, the door has to be open. And there are people, power looks a certain way, and often it doesn't look like me. So there are times when you have to knock on the door, and there are times when you have to bust the door down, and then there are times you have to make friends with the janitor so they let you in the back door. I mean, it's a tough thing to navigate, but if anyone needs allies and mentors and sponsors who don't look like you or do look like you, it's people with less power and less access. And so if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're a woman of color, you cannot let the fact that you're one of the only person in the room stop you. In fact, it is even more imperative, because no one is going to, your dad probably can't call someone and get you in the door.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
it's really important all the people, I'm African American. I grew up in the Midwest. And I will say this, growing up, my dad, when he told me life is not a meritocracy, he would take me around at the beginning of summer and introduce me to every single Black person that he knew. And he knew a lot because he's lived in our family has lived in Central Ohio for 8 generations. So he would introduce me to every single African-American person who worked in downtown Columbus. And then 2 weeks later, I would have a job working at the Department of Health, working at a law firm, working someplace. When I went off to Smith College in Massachusetts, when I went off to SAIS, I don't have deep roots of Black people that I can call on. Every single opportunity, all those opportunities that I spoke about early came from white people at events where I was less than 10% of the folks in the room. So it can be intimidating and it can be scary, but the more success you have, unless you're LeBron James, the rooms that you're in don't look like you. That's unfortunate, but if you let that stop you, you're not going to get very far. So,
Ileana, I'm sure you might have been in situations that are similar. Do you have any additional insight on that?
Yes, I do resonate a lot with what Anika said. The way that I navigated that reality, and I don't think in the beginning I realized I did it for this reason until later, but I really galvanized the Latino professional community in Washington, D.C. I'm actually if I can call myself a native Washingtonian, I grew up in the suburbs of Maryland. But being in DC was a completely different world because my family, they're immigrants from El Salvador, and they didn't have higher education. They couldn't really guide me. They hardly knew the language. Of course, they didn't have any context. They didn't even know how the system worked. And so it was very hard for me to understand how to navigate that. So when I knew I wanted to get an education. That's all I knew, I think, from, when I was younger. And then from there, I just gravitated towards people who did look like me and who I admired. And little by little, I really started to forge that strong network of those, that my community, so to speak, right? And then from there, I started to navigate other communities. I understood what it was like to to be with people who are our allies, who understands, may not have gone through the same situation, but understands the importance of diversity and having people that look like me or come from communities where I come from to be in those rooms. And so it is very difficult. And one of the things that Anika mentioned that I think is very important is, I think, when it's not so much as I'm being afraid of moving forward or being afraid because of imposter syndrome. I think it is imperative. It's almost a responsibility to forge forward, because that's the only way that younger generations of color are going to make it. If we give up, how are they ever going to have those doors open? So I think that's really important. I'll leave sort of with this last kind of thought. Whenever I really sum up the secret sauce, if you will, of kind of what I can recommend younger generations, I think it's important to be strategic. I think it's important to have grit, and I think it's important to work hard, because not everyone is going to. It's not about talent. I think it's about hard work, and having those combination of things is going to take you very far.
I think that's very, very important and a lot of great insight. Anika, do you have any last comments as well?
Yeah, I will say, I have been helped by people who I think of as amazing, wonderful friends. I've been helped by people who look like me and have had similar struggles to me. I've been helped by people who I would consider allies. I've also been helped by people who I would never even ask them how they voted, because I don't want to know. I've been helped by people who I wouldn't consider allies, but true to what Ileana said, they thought I was smart and hardworking and deserved a chance. But would I tell them about the last Black Lives Matter rally that I was at? Probably not. But they helped me. And so don't discount who can help you. And because helping people and building a relationship is a very personal thing. And there are categories for people in your life. There are people I would call, there are people I called when my mom got cancer, and then there are people I called when I needed advice on how to run my business. And, that's not necessarily the same group, and it's okay. So don't, I feel like we can't afford to cut ourselves off from the help that we receive before we get it, and to set conditions on it. Now, you shouldn't be exploited. You shouldn't be, tokenized. You should be respected. You shouldn't be harassed. But I think, cast as wide a net as possible. You're all at SAIS because you're smart and you're hardworking, and there's a whole world of people out there who are alums of SAIS, who are alums of Bloomberg, who are alums of Krieger, who are alums of completely different schools, who want to help you, and just make it as easy as possible for them by being polite and nice and engaging, and leave the rest to sort of time.
No, I think that's a lot of really great insight. And so much of what I enjoyed about this conversation is you're talking about yourselves in both the mentee and mentor settings, being able to give back, when you've been benefited from, certain relationships and things like that. Another key component of any networking, I think, that we always want to stress with students, especially, or those who might not know, is it's not about that ask. I think so much of what we do, especially in global careers and other places, is kind of do those trainings on how do you get into that network. And I think we had some great insight of, try the volunteering, try, get access to email lists and leverage that. Create an elevator pitch or some way of describing yourself very briefly. That's one of the things we often also describe to students. But so much of it is just beyond that one. I mean, you're going to spend a lot of time crafting that perfect informational interview. But once you're there, you have to be you. You have to be personable. You have to be engaging. You have to care about what they're speaking about. You have to listen. You can't be transactional. And so much of it is about just being a person that people want to know and will want to know for a really long time. And I think both of you did a great job of describing those elements and how those have impacted your life. So I did want to thank you both for coming today and sharing your insight on what I think is a really important topic now more than ever. And I think a lot of what we understood today is that networking is tough, and networking during COVID is tough. But you know, there are some benefits, you know, whether it's time and the ability to reach out to those outside of our own geographical area. Maybe it's trying to give each other a little bit more grace when normally we would put ourselves in a lot of pressure. So I think there are some insights to be gleaned from that as well. So thank you so much for coming. And I know that Theo wanted to say a few things too about this as well. Thanks, Theo.
Yes,
Sure.
I wanted to thank the panelists, both of you ladies. That was amazing. And if I could harp on one point that Ileana said that was really good, I think it's all students of color, especially since we've made it here at SAIS, it's our responsibility to really have that grit, really have that responsibility to push forward. And, you know, we may have roadblocks, but like she said, it is our responsibility to really push forward in these networking and get these jobs so we can really open it up for the future generation. I just want to thank again, Gwill. I want to thank the SAIS Diversity Council. I want to thank Rebecca and Global Careers. You guys were amazing. Thank you to all of our attendees who gave questions. And I just want to thank everybody who went to all the other Diversity Week events. Hopefully you enjoyed the other ones. And we will continue. I think there's one more event tomorrow, but I just want to thank everybody.
Thank you. I actually want to say one last thing. The Alumni Network is a really good network to really tap into, and I can't stress enough how much I'm available if you all want to reach me. I don't know how we can do this. I can either leave my email. I may not, as Anika said, I may not respond right away because I have a couple of things going on, but I will respond because I think it's important to pay it forward.
Agreed.
So important, yeah. So again, finally, I'd like to just conclude by saying, you know, there are quite a few resources available through Global Careers, through each other, through LinkedIn and other platforms, but please do sign up for that one-hop mentoring that will start in late October. That's a great way of just really opening the field out. Thanks. She seconds it.
As a mentor on it. I would highly encourage it, partly because it opens you up to, you know, and the story I tell, and then I promise I'll stop. I organized an event with the Bloomberg Alumni Association in New York, and it was on global health and innovation. And there were alums from Bloomberg, SAIS, Hopkins undergrad, and the medical school. So there is a SAIS UN club, and they used to meet every Wednesday for drinks. The person who spoke on the panel about the UN, what the UN is doing on global health and innovation, was a very high up director, the highest ranking person I'd ever met at the UN, in a position to hire people. He didn't go to SAIS. He went to Hopkins undergrad. And so I told him, hey, there's a SAIS UN group that meets every week. And he's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. I would love to like hire SAIS people. And I thought, oh, what a waste. It's a group of folks that meet every week. And we tend to think, well, obviously, if you work for the UN, you went to SAIS. But that's not necessarily true. And there are folks out there, you know, we're part of this school with 9 divisions. And like, true to sort of what I said before, don't cut yourself off from people potentially helping you because they didn't specifically go to SAIS, because he was speaking at that time, you know, oh, I'd love to hire SAISers. They're perfect for what I hire for. So one hop would be a way to connect to a really
greater Hopkins network. Great, thank you so much.